the fall before the rise, the courtroom was cold. Not just from the air conditioning, but from the tension that filled the space. Thick silence wrapped around every wooden bench and every watching face. The walls, once bright and clean, now seemed gray and faded under the weight of expectation. On one side stood the prosecution team, confident, tall, their suits ironed, their voices smooth. On the other side, standing quietly behind a worn wooden table, was a man in a simple white shirt, hands folded, eyes steady. His name was Sundar Pichai, but no one in the courtroom seemed to care who he was. Not yet. Not even the judge, who gave a short laugh as Sundar rose to speak. It was the kind of laugh that carries judgment, the kind that says, "You don't belong here." The judge leaned forward, voice dripping with disbelief, and asked, "You're defending yourself?" Sundar nodded. No lawyer, no team, just himself. The judge smiled again, shaking his head. "This should be interesting," he muttered. People, watching, began to whisper. Some laughed, some rolled their eyes. They had heard the story from the media. A big tech executive accused of violating ethical codes, of pushing too far in his pursuit of innovation. Headlines painted him as another greedy man in a suit. But the real story was deeper. No one in the room knew what Sundar had sacrificed, or how he had even ended up here. To understand that, you'd have to go back. A few months earlier, Sundar was living what most would call a dream. The CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the world. Meetings in glass towers, speeches at global events, applause after every word. But what people didn't see was how lonely it had become. Every decision he made was met with scrutiny. Every innovation faced resistance. And when he tried to push an idea meant to help billions of people, an idea about making internet access free and truly open for everyone, he faced enemies he never expected. The pushback came quietly at first. Gentle reminders from board members. Soft concerns whispered in meetings. But when he didn't back down, it turned louder. Investors threatened to pull funding. Media outlets twisted his words. People he trusted began to distance themselves, and then came the legal attack. They said he was misusing company resources. They said he was bypassing regulations. In truth, he was doing neither. He had simply found a way to bypass the middlemen, giant corporations that profited from limited access, and give real control to the people. And that was a threat to many. Sundar's lawyers advised him to settle, to apologize publicly, to walk away with his reputation half intact. But Sundar couldn't do it. Not because of pride, not because of ego, but because he remembered where he came from. He remembered the dusty streets of Chennai, the small home where electricity would cut out at night. He remembered studying under the dim light of a candle, his mother cooking rice nearby. He remembered the long bus rides to school, the hard bench seats, the quiet hunger in his stomach. And he remembered the first time he saw a computer. It was old, slow, and barely worked. But it opened a door in his mind that never closed again. Technology had changed his life. It had lifted him out of struggle. And now he wanted to make sure that same door stayed open for others. He believed access to knowledge should not depend on your income. And for that belief, he was being dragged to court. So, now in this cold courtroom, Sundar stood alone. But there was no bitterness in his face, no anger, only calm. He waited as the prosecution began their argument. They were aggressive, clever with their words, confident in their strategy. They painted him as a rule breaker, a manipulator. They showed charts, data, and testimonies from former employees. Each one carefully selected to shape a particular image. People in the room began to shift in their seats. Even those who had walked in with curiosity were starting to believe the story being told. Sundar looked around and saw it. The doubt. The suspicion. He had seen those looks before. In boardrooms, in media interviews, even in school when he was the quiet boy with a strange name and big dreams. But he didn't flinch. He knew they only had half the story. When it was finally his turn to speak, the judge sighed as if he was already bored. But Sundar didn't react. He stepped forward, gently adjusted the microphone and began, not with a defense but with a story. "A few years ago," he said softly, "I was visiting a village in India. There was a young girl, maybe 10 years old, standing near a dusty road holding a smartphone. It was cracked, slow, and the battery barely held, but she was using it to learn English, to teach herself science. And when I asked her why, she said, 'Because I want to become like you.'" The courtroom grew still. "This case," Sundar continued, "is not about rules. It's about power. And who gets to decide who deserves knowledge?" His voice was calm, but his words were sharp. Not rehearsed, not dramatic, just real. He didn't speak like a lawyer. He spoke like a man who had lived the truth he was defending. And slowly, something in the room began to change. People leaned in. The whispering stopped. But before he could go deeper, the prosecution interrupted. They objected, said it was irrelevant. The judge, clearly unimpressed, sustained the objection and told Sundar to stick to facts. So he did. He opened a folder filled with documents no one had seen before. He showed evidence of how the system had been rigged, of secret deals, of blocked innovations. He showed how every step he took to help people had been met with sabotage, not because it was illegal, but because it was disruptive. And then came the twist. One of the key witnesses against him, an executive who had accused him of misconduct, had recently left the company and joined one of its biggest competitors. Sundar revealed this with quiet precision, showing how this witness stood to gain millions if Sundar was removed. The courtroom gasped. The judge leaned forward now, no longer laughing. But Sundar didn't celebrate. He simply paused, took a breath, and said, "Truth doesn't need to shout." Outside, the media still called him arrogant, a man playing hero. But inside that room, something had shifted. People were no longer sure what to believe. The lines weren't so clear anymore, and the judge, who had started the day laughing, now watched Sundar with a new kind of silence. Still, the trial had just begun, and what lay ahead was more dangerous than Sundar had imagined, because the next witness was someone Sundar had once called a friend, and she was about to reveal something that could destroy everything. The betrayal the next morning, the air in the courtroom felt different, heavier. There was no laughter from the judge this time, no amused smirk. The silence before the session began was not the kind of silence that comes from boredom. It was the silence that follows confusion, the kind that follows doubt. Sundar stood alone again at his table, his simple shirt gently wrinkled, his hands resting calmly on a small stack of notes. His face gave nothing away, but behind his eyes there was tension. He knew what was coming. The prosecution was ready. Today, they were not just trying to win. They were trying to break him. And for that, they had brought someone special to the stand. Her name was Neela Ramaswamy. When she entered the room, Sundar's breath caught just slightly. No one noticed except maybe her. She walked with quiet confidence, a graceful step that didn't need to demand attention, because it always came naturally. Her dark hair was pinned neatly, her eyes focused, not on Sundar, but on the judge. She didn't look left, didn't glance at her old friend, didn't offer even a nod of recognition. Years ago, Neela and Sundar had built something together. It hadn't been a company or a product, but trust. She was one of the first people Sundar had brought into his inner circle when he became CEO. They had worked late into the night on ideas no one believed in. They had argued, challenged each other, and laughed when no one else understood the joke. She was more than a colleague. She was one of the few people who truly understood why he did what he did. But now, she was the star witness against him. As she sat down, the lead prosecutor stood and began with a simple question. "Miss Ramaswamy, can you tell the court how long you worked under Mr. Pichai?" 8 years, she replied, her voice steady. "And in that time, would you say you were close to him professionally?" A pause. "Yes." "Would you say he trusted you?" Another pause. "Yes." The prosecutor turned to face the jury, and Did you witness him using company resources for a project that was not approved by the board? The air went still. Neela looked straight ahead. Yes, I did. The words dropped like stones. Sundar closed his eyes briefly, not in defeat but in pain. It wasn't just what she said. It was that she believed it. Can you describe what you saw? The prosecutor continued. Neela explained that Sundar had diverted a small team, engineers, analysts, designers, to work on a platform that was not listed in the official roadmap. The prosecution claimed this was a secret project, a rogue mission. But what Neela described wasn't an attack on the company. It was a plan to distribute free, high-quality educational content to regions with no internet infrastructure. A platform that required only a basic signal, something that could run on outdated phones even in areas with unstable electricity. He didn't present it to the board because he knew they'd reject it, she said. He told me the board wouldn't understand. There was a quiet murmur from the audience. The judge tapped his gavel, but Sundar didn't move. He just listened. Quietly. Fully. After the questioning ended, it was Sundar's turn. He stood slowly, walked to the front, and looked at Neela for the first time in years. Neela, he said gently, do you remember that night in Nairobi, the school we visited? Her expression didn't change. We saw children sitting on the ground, using chalk to draw computers on the floor because they had none. You said, we need to do more than sell tools, we need to change the system. I remember that. Do you? Her eyes flickered. Just for a moment. Then her voice returned. This isn't about that night. It's about what's legal. Sundar nodded. So let's talk about what's legal, he said. He pulled out a binder from his bag, thick, worn. He opened it to a bookmarked page and began reading aloud. It was a policy, one the board had signed 2 years prior, allowing innovation experiments under a specific threshold without board approval, so long as they didn't compromise financial performance. The platform he had built, Sundar explained, was fully funded by a personal grant he had set aside. No company money, no redirection of business resources. The team? Volunteers, working after hours. Every legal box checked. The room grew quiet. Again. You believed in this, he said to Neela softly. You were the first to write code for it. She didn't respond. He took a breath. I didn't tell the board because I was hiding something. I didn't tell them because they had already shut down 5 projects aimed at the same communities. Not because they didn't work, but because they didn't make profit. He turned to the judge. Sometimes what's right doesn't come with approval. The judge leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the desk. The prosecution looked uneasy. Neela looked at her hands. The tension in the room had turned. The people watching were no longer sure who the villain was. And then Sundar said something unexpected. Your Honor, I would like to submit an email. He handed over a printed message. It was from Neela, dated just a few weeks before the trial. In it, she thanked Sundar for what he was doing, said she wished she could help him, but couldn't risk her job, said she was being pressured by forces she didn't name. The judge read it in silence. The prosecution tried to object, but the judge held up his hand. Overruled, he said, eyes still scanning the email. Neela looked like she had been struck. Her lips parted, then closed again. She wasn't angry. She was ashamed, and everyone saw it. The judge turned to her. Miss Ramaswamy, he said slowly, would you like to revise your testimony? She hesitated, looked at Sundar. For the first time that day, their eyes truly met, and she said nothing. Outside, reporters scrambled to adjust their headlines. Inside, Sundar quietly returned to his seat, never once showing pride or anger. Just calm, just grace, and something even stronger. Sadness. The judge called for a recess. The courtroom emptied, but Sundar stayed seated, alone again. He had survived the day, but barely. And what he didn't know was that while he was inside defending his name, something was happening outside the courtroom. Something that would bring his fight to the front page in a way he couldn't control. A video had just been leaked. A video that showed Sundar saying something in private, something that would be taken wildly out of context, and tomorrow it would go viral. The storm outside. The next morning, the courthouse steps were buried under camera tripods and reporters shouting over one another. Dozens of microphones waited, like hungry mouths, hoping to catch even a glance, a word, a reaction. The trial had already drawn attention, but today it had exploded. The internet was flooded. News alerts pinged on phones around the world. Sundar Pichai was trending everywhere, but not for what had happened inside the courtroom yesterday. It was because of a video, a short, grainy clip, 37 seconds long, filmed without Sundar's knowledge at a private internal company gathering almost a year ago. Someone had recorded it and sent it to the media with a single sentence. Look what he really thinks. In the video, Sundar is standing before a group of engineers. He's speaking casually, passionately. But then comes the line, cut cleanly from a longer discussion. We can't wait for regulators. If we want to help the poor, sometimes we have to go around the system. Taken alone, it sounded dangerous, rebellious, even arrogant. News outlets ran with it. Headlines screamed, "Tech CEO defies law to push agenda." Social media boiled with opinion. Some called him a fraud. Others called him a hero. Politicians weighed in. Investors panicked. And in the middle of the storm, Sundar walked silently through the crowd, pushing through the doors of the courthouse into the eye of a hurricane he hadn't created but now had to survive. Inside the courtroom, everything felt sharper. Eyes followed him with new suspicion. Even the judge seemed heavier, more guarded. Sundar sat down at his place, his fingers resting gently on the edge of the table. He didn't fidget. He didn't flinch. But he felt the weight pressing against his chest, slow and heavy like a hand trying to push him down. Before the trial resumed, the judge addressed the courtroom. "I am aware of the recent video that has circulated," he said. "Let me remind everyone that what happens outside this court may shape public opinion, but it does not shape legal judgment. However," he paused, "if any material from that video is relevant to this case, I expect it to be submitted through the proper process." The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, we intend to do just that." Sundar closed his eyes. Not in fear, but in preparation. He had expected something like this. Not this exact video, not this exact day. But he had known that, the moment he stood for something bigger than profits, something meant for people instead of shareholders, the world would come for him. It always did. Not with guns or fists, but with headlines and doubt. The video was played in court. Silence fell again as Sundar's words echoed from the speakers. The clip was short, loud, and delivered like a punch. Sundar watched the jurors' faces as they listened. Confusion, surprise, concern. The prosecutor wasted no time. "Mr. Pichai," he said, rising, "do you stand by those words?" Sundar took the microphone slowly, his voice quiet but firm. "Yes, but not the way they were taken." The prosecutor stepped closer. "You're saying this was edited?" "I'm saying it was incomplete. So explain it to us. What did you mean by go around the system?" Sundar looked at the jury. "When you grow up in a place where people wait 10 years for clean water, you understand something most people don't. Systems don't always work. Sometimes, systems forget people. And when that happens, you have to find a way, not to break the law but to bend the silence. I was talking about finding creative legal paths when traditional ones fail. Open source tools, peer education networks, community-led innovation, all legal, all effective, but different." The courtroom was still. "You cannot fix broken things by standing still," he continued. "And when the system is slow, the poor suffer. The children lose years. The sick lose hope. The ambitious lose time. I was telling my team not to give up, not to wait for permission to dream." There was no applause. This was not a rally. But something in the room shifted again. A quiet stirring. like people beginning to question what they thought they knew. The prosecutor tried again. But don't. You agree, Mr. Pichai, that skipping approval even with good intentions can lead to abuse? Sundar didn't blink. Yes, that's why we kept records. Why we documented every line of code, every dollar spent, every hour worked. I didn't skip approval. I followed a different path, within the rules allowed, but not within the comfort of power. It was a subtle line, and powerful, because comfort was the real issue here. Sundar hadn't broken the law. He had broken tradition, and for that, many wanted to see him punished. A recess was called. As people filed out, Sundar remained, seated, again alone. Neela approached him quietly. Her voice was barely above a whisper. You knew this was coming, didn't you? Not exactly this, Sundar replied. But I knew the price. She looked at him for a long time. Why didn't you fight back harder when I testified? He turned to her, his voice soft. Because I wasn't here to destroy you. I was here to defend what matters. Outside the courthouse, protests had started. Some were against him. Others, surprisingly, were in support. People holding signs that read open access for all. Innovation is not a crime. We see you, Sundar. Students, activists, even some former employees who had once walked away now stood holding his name high. But none of it made the next witness any easier. The judge called, the court back to order. Prosecution, please call your next witness. The name echoed through the room. Pichai. Sundar froze. His younger brother. Someone he had loved and protected since they were children in a one-room apartment. Someone he hadn't spoken to in nearly 2 years. And now, here he was. Walking to the stand, looking older than Sundar remembered, his face tired, carrying the weight of something no one yet understood. No one except Sundar. As Anand took his seat and raised his hand to swear his oath, Sundar felt his heartbeat slow and deepen, not from fear, but from something worse. Regret. He knew what Anand was about to say, and he knew it could destroy everything he had worked for. Blood on the stand. The courtroom door closed behind Anand Pichai with a deep, echoing click that seemed to silence even the air itself. People shifted in their seats, craning their necks for a better view of the man who had just entered. There was no media image of him. He wasn't a public figure, just a man in a plain shirt and jacket, walking slowly toward the witness stand, his head down, shoulders tight. But to Sundar, he wasn't just any man. He was the boy Sundar once shared a bed with, half a blanket between them. He was the kid who used to chase him down dusty streets after school, carrying stories from their favorite books. He was the one Sundar had protected from bullies, the one he had promised over and over again that he would build a better world for, and now that same brother was being called to testify against him. The prosecutor wasted no time. Mr. Anand Pichai, he began, can you tell the court your relationship to the defendant? Anand cleared his throat. He's my older brother. And for how long were you employed at the same company? Almost 4 years. And during those 4 years, did you ever work on a project that was not listed in your official job description? Anand looked over at Sundar briefly. It wasn't a glare. It wasn't warm either. It was the look of a man remembering everything at once, every conversation, every dream, every betrayal. Yes, he said, I did. Can you explain? Anand spoke slowly, carefully. There was a project called Pathways. It wasn't on the roadmap. It wasn't talked about in board meetings. It was something Sundar was working on quietly, outside the company's public priorities. He brought in a few of us who believed in the mission. The prosecutor nodded, pretending to be neutral. And did you express any concerns at the time? A pause. Yes. What kind? I was afraid it would backfire, that it would be misunderstood, that people wouldn't see the intention, just the process. The prosecutor stepped closer. And did you ever tell your brother that directly? Anand swallowed hard. Many times. That part hurt Sundar more than anything said so far. Not because it was untrue, but because it was. He remembered those late-night calls. Anand warning him, gently, almost pleading, saying things like, "You can't keep fighting alone, or the board's already watching you, or don't become the enemy of your own dream." And Sundar, so locked in his mission, had always answered with the same calm resistance. "This isn't about safety. It's about need." He never raised his voice. But maybe that made it worse. Maybe Anand needed to hear doubt in him, just once, and never did. Back in the courtroom, the prosecutor turned slightly, addressing the jury now. "Mr. Pichai," he said carefully, "do you believe your brother misused his power?" Anand didn't answer right away. His voice finally came, low and cracked. "I believe he believed he was doing the right thing. But I also believe he crossed lines that shouldn't have been crossed." A sharp silence followed, and Sundar didn't move, didn't blink, because deep inside, he knew what was really being said. This wasn't a technical accusation. It was a personal wound. A wound Sundar had never tried to bandage. He stood up slowly, ready to question his brother. The courtroom watched with an intensity so thick it felt like no one dared to breathe. Sundar approached the stand. No notebook, no evidence. Just him. "Anand," he said quietly. "Why didn't you call me before this trial started?" Anand's jaw tightened. "Because you wouldn't have listened. You don't know that." "I do," he snapped, his voice rising. "Because you stopped listening years ago." A gasp moved through the courtroom. The judge didn't stop it. Sundar remained calm. Not defensive. Not angry. "You think I stopped listening because I didn't agree?" Anand laughed bitterly. "No. I think you stopped listening because you forgot what we used to talk about. You said we'd build together. Not that you'd run ahead and expect the rest of us to follow without question. I never wanted you to follow. I wanted you to lead with me. Then why didn't you tell me the full plan? Why didn't you trust me?" There it was. Not a legal issue. A fracture of trust. Sundar took a step back. He looked down for a moment, then met his brother's eyes again. "I thought I was protecting you," he said quietly. "I thought if this all collapsed, at least you wouldn't be dragged down with me." Anand's face changed. Not softened, but shifted. "You don't get to protect people by shutting them out," he said. The judge finally raised his hand. "That's enough," he said. This is not a family counseling session. But everyone in the courtroom had felt it. Something very real had just happened, and it wasn't over. Sundar returned to his seat. He didn't feel like he had won or lost that exchange. It wasn't about winning. It was about what had broken between them. Maybe long ago. Maybe the moment Sundar became a symbol instead of a brother. The prosecution rested for the day. The judge announced that the defense would begin presenting their full argument the following morning. As the room emptied, Sundar sat alone once more. Outside, the courthouse, the protests were louder, some angry, some hopeful, but they weren't the real storm anymore. The real storm was the next witness Sundar planned to call, someone who had been inside the boardroom during the moment Sundar had been locked out, someone who knew the truth about why his proposal had been buried. But that witness was scared, and Sundar didn't know if she would actually show up. Her name was Dr. Maya Sarkar, and she had everything to lose by stepping into that courtroom. The woman who knew too much, the fifth day of the trial, began with clouds. Thick and gray, they hung low over the courthouse like a warning. Rain hadn't started yet, but it was coming. The kind of storm that creeps in slow, patient, waiting for the perfect moment to break. The crowd outside had doubled since yesterday. Supporters and critics stood shoulder to shoulder, some shouting, others silent, all waiting for what they now believed would be the most important day of the trial. Inside, the courtroom felt smaller than ever. It was full to the edges. The air was tight, dense with breath and questions. Even the judge seemed different, more focused, less casual. He wasn't just overseeing a case anymore. He was witnessing a fight that had spilled far beyond legal boundaries. Sundar sat at his table, his back straight, eyes on the door. Today everything depended on one person. Not a lawyer, not an executive, not a politician, but a woman with a quiet voice and a sharper mind than most people ever realized. Maya Sarkar, former ethics officer, former board advisor, former friend. For months she had disappeared. No one knew where she had gone after resigning from the company. Some said she had moved abroad. Others said she had been paid to keep silent. Only Sundar knew the truth. She had disappeared to protect herself, and now she was risking everything by coming back. When the door opened and she stepped in, a ripple moved through the room. She wasn't dressed like someone making a grand statement. No designer suit, no camera-ready colors. Just a plain dark sweater, black trousers, and a worn satchel under her arm. Her face was calm, unreadable. But her eyes, they were locked forward, determined, heavy with purpose. The courtroom stood still as she made her way to the witness stand. The clerk administered the oath. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" She nodded. "I do." Sundar stood and approached. This was his witness, his final card, and he knew the cost of playing it. "Dr. Sarkar," he began, "you were present at the board meeting on March 12th, last year. Can you tell the court what the meeting was about?" Maya took a slow breath. The main topic was the proposal for Project Pathways, the same project you are now on trial for. And what was the board's reaction? They rejected it. Why? She looked at the jury. Because they believed it would disrupt existing contracts with telecom providers. Because it would reduce the company's long-term monetization potential in emerging markets. Because they thought giving away internet access and educational content for free would hurt revenue forecasts. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Sundar continued, voice steady. "And what did you advise, Dr. Sarkar?" "I said we should approve it. I said that ethics cannot only be about avoiding harm. They must also be about choosing good when we have the chance." "And what happened after the meeting?" She hesitated now, not out of fear, out of pain. "I received a private warning from 2 senior board members. They said if I continued to push your proposal, I would be removed from the ethics team and likely blacklisted from future appointments. They called it a conflict of interest. And was it? No, it was a cover." The courtroom froze. The judge leaned forward. "Dr. Sarkar," he said, "do you have evidence to support this?" She reached into her satchel. "Yes, Your Honor." She pulled out a series of printed documents, emails, board memos, messages marked confidential. She handed them to the court clerk, who delivered them to the bench. The judge read in silence for several minutes. As the courtroom waited, Maya continued speaking. "I knew what would happen to Sundar. I knew they would push him out quietly, if he didn't walk away. But when he didn't leave, they changed the strategy. They decided to punish him publicly, to make an example out of him. Why? Because they were afraid of what he represented, not just change, not just progress, but a kind of leadership that doesn't ask for permission to do the right thing." The judge finally looked up. His expression had changed. These weren't just claims, they were proof. Sundar turned back to Maya. "Why are you here now?" Her eyes softened. She looked at him the way someone looks at a person they once trusted completely, and maybe still do. "Because I couldn't stay silent anymore. Because you didn't just risk your career, you risked your name. And because the truth, when hidden, becomes its own kind of crime." For the first time in the entire trial, Sundar felt the weight in his chest ease just slightly. The prosecution tried to push back. They questioned her memory, her motivations, her timing. But Maya stood firm. Every question she answered with precision. Every challenge she met with clarity. And the documents she provided left little room for interpretation. What had looked like arrogance on Sundar's part was now beginning to look like courage. And what had looked like a crime was starting to look like a choice. An uncomfortable, difficult, necessary choice to fight for something that couldn't wait. By the end of her testimony, the jury wasn't just watching her. They were listening to her, really listening. The judge called for a recess, a longer one. He needed time to review the documents in full, to verify their legitimacy, to understand the implications. As people filed out of the courtroom, Sundar stayed behind again. Maya came to him, her voice low. "You still have enemies," she said. I know, he replied. But now you have something stronger. What's that? A record. Outside, the rain had finally started, soft at first, then steady. The crowd outside began to scatter, but many stayed. Under umbrellas, under cardboard, under nothing at all. They stayed because something had changed, and they could feel it. But back inside, another storm was still forming. One final witness had filed an emergency request to testify. Someone unexpected. Someone who had once called Sundar a competitor. Someone whose words could either seal his freedom or end everything. Her name was Elena Bright, the CEO of a rival company, and she had asked for a private session with the judge. The final voice, the rain didn't stop overnight. It fell harder, as if the sky itself was trying to wash away the weeks of tension, the noise, the weight of everything that had been said and left unsaid. Inside the courthouse, the walls seemed darker, the lights dimmer, the floor cold under tired feet. The trial had stretched into something far beyond anyone's expectations. It was no longer just a case. It was a question. When the entire world was now asking, what is the cost of doing what is right? When Sundar stepped into the courtroom that morning, he carried no notes, no new witnesses, no strategy, just calm. Behind his eyes was a storm of emotion, grief, fatigue, memories he hadn't touched in years, but none of it showed on his face. The crowd in the gallery leaned forward as he passed. Some smiled, some stared. All of them felt something that couldn't be explained. Today would be the last day, but no one knew how it would end. The judge entered quietly, his expression unreadable. The jury filed in, and then the bailiff announced the arrival of a special witness, one who had been approved in a private session the night before. Elena Bright. Her name alone caused whispers. Elena was a powerhouse, sharp, competitive, relentless. The CEO of one of the largest tech firms in the world. She and Sundar had been professional rivals for years, not enemies, not friends. Just two minds pushing in opposite directions, competing for market share, for innovation, headlines, for the future. And yet here she was. As she walked to the witness stand, everything about her was deliberate. Her stride, her posture, her silence. She didn't look at Sundar. Not yet. Only at the judge. After being sworn in, she leaned into the microphone. Thank you for allowing me to speak, Your Honor. The judge gave a single nod. Elena looked at the jury. I'm not here today as a competitor, she began. I'm here as a witness, and maybe finally as a human being who's tired of watching good things get buried. She paused. Her voice, though steady, carried a weight of personal truth. I've spent my entire career chasing numbers, performance metrics, shareholder trust, and yes, I've succeeded. But 3 months ago, I discovered internal documents from a strategy session we held last year. Documents that mentioned project pathways. Documents that tracked Sundar's progress. We weren't watching it to admire it. We were watching it to stop it. The courtroom froze. Our team had analyzed the risk. We realized that if his platform reached full implementation, it would shift the balance of tech infrastructure in underdeveloped regions, not toward profit, but toward people, and we couldn't allow that. She looked down, ashamed. We advised our board to lobby against it quietly, to fund opinion pieces, to pressure partners into pulling support. We didn't care if it helped millions. We only cared that it didn't help us. A gasp moved through the room like a wave. The judge tapped his gavel, but he didn't interrupt. Elena continued, I came here today to tell the truth, not because I expect forgiveness, but because we cannot keep pretending that visionaries are criminals simply because they don't wait for permission to build something better. She turned finally to Sundar. I fought you for years, but I never saw you clearly until you stood alone in this courtroom. Sundar didn't speak. He only nodded, gracefully, humbly, and something in the room shifted again. For once there was no argument, no objection, just the still piercing sound of truth. When Elena stepped down, the judge called a short recess. The jurors would return for closing arguments, but something deeper had already closed, a truth sealed in silence, undeniable. raw, and powerful. As Sundar prepared his final words, he thought about everything. His mother's small kitchen back in Chennai, the rusted fan spinning over his childhood bed, the sound of his father's bicycle at dusk, the first computer he touched, the first time he failed, the long walk to school, the days he had no lunch, but never showed it, and the promise he made to himself barefoot under a tree at age 10, if I ever make it, I will never forget who I made it for. And he hadn't. As he rose for closing statements, his voice didn't shake. Your Honor, members of the jury, I came here accused of breaking rules. I stand here knowing I followed something more important, principles. He walked slowly, calmly. I didn't build pathways for glory. I built it because I believe no child should have to wait for a miracle to learn. No girl should be told she cannot dream because her village has no internet. No boy should choose labor over school because education is locked behind a paywall. He stopped near the jury. I did not ask for applause. I asked for change. And change is uncomfortable. It threatens comfort. It challenges systems. But it is necessary. He looked at them, not to plead, not to persuade, but simply to share. I leave the verdict in your hands. But whatever you decide, I will keep building. Because the truth is not something you win. It is something you live. The courtroom was silent. Not from fear, not from judgment, from respect. Deep, shaken, humbled, respect. The jury left to deliberate. The world waited. An hour passed, then 2, and then 3, and finally the doors opened. 12 people walked in. The foreperson stood. The judge asked the question, have you reached a verdict? Yes, Your Honor. And how do you find the defendant? A pause. Not guilty? A sound erupted in the courtroom. Not cheers, not noise. Just the soft, overwhelming sound of people breathing again. Relief. Belief. Hope. Sundar closed his eyes, not to celebrate, but to remember. Because this was never about winning. It was about holding on to what mattered. Even when the world let go, Maya approached him quietly, and stood nearby, eyes red. Even Neela, her expression broken open by truth, gave a small nod. And outside, under umbrellas and breaking skies, thousands of strangers waited, not for a hero, but for a reminder. That one voice, one soul, one act of courage can still matter, and it did. It always will.